Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. More on that later. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today's video, whether or not the 18th century British Army was actually the greatest in the world. As regular viewers of our channel know, we've been doing a series covering all of the battles of the American Revolutionary War. Throughout the course of researching those videos, time and time again we've come across the claim that America's soldiers bested the greatest army in the world. For instance, in a lecture on the history of the US military, General Wesley K. Clark calls the British Army the finest fighting force in the world. And in the book 1776, The World Turned Upside Down, it is written that the Redcoat was quite the finest soldier of his day. He only lost one battle during the whole American Revolution, fighting in the Orthodox formations. Every part of what I just read is flat out wrong, and the funny thing is that outside of the context of the American Revolution, we rarely see historians make the same claim. That got us on the Armchair Historian team wondering, was Britain's 18th century army really the best? Great Britain's position as a military power isn't really up to debate. But as an island nation, its greatest military asset was the awe-inspiring Royal Navy. To assess how the Army measured up, we'll be looking at a handful of specific categories: leadership and logistics, training, size, and finally, its actual record in warfare. We're also going to be comparing the British with some of the other European great powers at the time, especially France and Prussia, which some military historians refer to as the gold standard of 18th century armies. With all of that said, let's begin with our first category: leadership. Leadership within the British Army was, like in other nations at the time, largely dominated by wealth. Commissions had to be purchased, and the going rate was not cheap. Usually, only wealthy landowners could afford to buy commissions, so it was not an especially meritocratic system. While offering leadership positions on the basis of wealth wasn't unusual, it certainly wasn't beneficial for British leadership. For much of the 18th century, no formal training institution existed for British Army officers, nor was military experience required to purchase a commission, just a recommendation from a major or higher. However, some of the officers on the ground did receive an education. The Royal Military Academy at Woolwich was opened in 1741, but it only trained officers in the Engineering and Artillery Corps. Compare this to the contemporary Prussian army, which opened its first major officer cadet school, the Kadettenhaus, in 1716. Now, let's take a look at the army's structure. The organization of the British Army was kind of a mess. There were a number of divisional commanders with one commander-in-chief to preside over the entirety of the army, a position that was often vacant. When someone actually did hold the job, they were often preoccupied by conflicts all over the world. For instance, Jeffrey Amherst, a man I doubt you've ever heard of, was in charge during the American Revolution and had to juggle another half-dozen simultaneous or near-simultaneous conflicts in which Britain was embroiled. In the absence of any overall organizational direction, individual generals, high-ranking civilian diplomats, and even corporate interests like the British East India Company had enormous control over troop deployment and strategy. With so many different people exercising or trying to exercise power, there was very little cohesion. What's more, artillery gunners and engineers technically weren't even part of the army. Instead, they took orders from the Board of Ordnance, with their own ranks, organization, supplies, and medical services. The army's bureaucratic tangle was a nightmare of incoherence, insufficiently undone by mediocre leaders. As a result, it proved difficult to coordinate on a large scale, and logistics frequently had to be handled on a local level. More often than not, commanders had to finance their own units while abroad and would only be reimbursed later. Nonetheless, Britain made up for this shortcoming in the training of its common soldiers, which was rather impressive. Before they ever saw battle, new recruits were thoroughly drilled in accordance with impressive command manuals, such as those written by John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough. The quality and standardization of this training helped establish the British Army's reputation for being able to turn any man into an effective soldier. Troops were highly disciplined, and lapses were often punished harshly, with penalties including flogging, branding, and even execution for repeated deserters. That strictness did wonders for discipline, but often did the opposite for morale, which proved to be a long-running problem for the Army. That was predictably an even bigger problem among those who were forced to join. Military service was also often used as a punishment for certain crimes. Those convicted of public drunkenness, vagrancy, and unpaid debt were frequently conscripted. Press gangs were not uncommon, and their proliferation was actually one of the causes for the War of 1812 with the United States. Still, the level of discipline of British soldiers was undeniably impressive, even if many of the people that served in it did so begrudgingly. Redcoats could hold a line and maintain an impressive rate of fire on par with the best armies in the world, and just about anyone could be trained to be one of them. Before we move on, it is important to note that the 18th century featured a prolific amount of global conflicts. Because of this, British military discipline and leadership quality had many troughs and peaks depending on when or where the war was fought. The last factor we'll talk about today is the Army's overall size. During the 18th century, the British Army had around 120,000 to 150,000 soldiers at its peak, and 45,000 at its lowest. That's compared to the peak of 200,000 that the Prussians had at its disposal, or the 130,000 that the French had toward the turn of the century. While that many redcoats sounds impressive, let's consider the fact that neither of those countries had an empire that compared to the size of Great Britain, especially after the 7 Years' War. Thus, mercenary groups, usually German ones, were often relied upon to supplement troop numbers. In the American Revolutionary War alone, 37% of the 78,000 British troops that fought in the Americas were German mercenaries. But everything we've discussed here today hardly means a thing if we don't look at the actual record of British successes and failures on the battlefield. The British fought 6 major wars during the 18th century and won just 3 of them, maybe 4 depending on who you ask. Before we get to our final conclusion, a word from our sponsor, NordVPN. Many people neglect online privacy, but since we're living during a digital age where one of these isn't the most effective means of protecting yourself anymore, NordVPN provides a way to keep your information safe and secure. Cybersecurity may seem very complex, but NordVPN makes protecting your information as easy as possible. Using some of the newest technology available, NordVPN shields your internet activity even when connected to public Wi-Fi. They'll protect you from hackers, malware, and even guarantee that your home never be burnt down by British redcoats. Except for that last point, you can get NordVPN for 75% off, which is only $2.99 a month. And if you use my coupon code HISTORY, you'll get an entire month for free. We are confident that you will be satisfied with the results. If not, cybersecurity guarantees your money back up to 30 days. Overall, Britain's army was not terrible, but it certainly wasn't the battlefield-dominating force you hear about in high school textbooks or documentaries shown on the so-called History Channel. In fact, considering the excellent new model army of the 17th century, the performance of Britain's ground forces was comparatively lackluster. The Navy, on the other hand, was, quite reasonably, always seen as absolutely vital to British national security and thus better maintained. So our conclusion is that Britain's army was not the finest in the world during the 18th century, but it didn't need to be. The thriving global empire Britain was building relied heavily on its navy, and more often than not, its ground forces faced non-European foes with poorly organized and technologically backward militaries. And if Britain couldn't conquer the foe in question using its army, it could utilize its superior navy to isolate and starve her enemy, a tactic that continued to be used for much of Britain's history.